this is it. This is the future. It's finally arrived. We fast forwarded, 10 years and 2 weeks, and this is it. The disruption that we've long preached has arrived, and there's no going back. There's no going back to schools. It's so much more efficient to teach every student in the world online. It's going to be customized and wonderful. There's no going back to the office. We don't need offices and commutes and those horrible office relations and the bad birthdays and the, abusive relationships and power dynamics and cubicles and uncomfortable desks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Field Tripping. Joining us today is an award-winning writer and speaker whose relentless curiosity has helped him identify unseen trends emerging in the world around us. His journalistic writings have been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Bloomberg, and have earned him the kudos of having real and lasting charm by the New York Times. His books include Save the Deli, The Tastemakers, the award-winning The Revenge of Analog, and the forthcoming book, The Future is Analog. His name is David Sachs, and he's here today to talk to us, amongst other things, about why a noisy, smelly, messy, beautiful, wonderful, textured, non-pixelated world is our real future. David, thanks for joining us today, and welcome to Field Tripping.
My pleasure.
It's good to see you, dude. So my first question for you today is, what did you have for lunch, and what is it about lunch meetings that you love in particular?
I did not have a lunch meeting today, but I did have a really good lunch. I made a kind of corn chowder last night. Very simple. Strip the kernels off the corn. Then make sure you scrape with the back of the knife to get all the juicy bits out. Put that in a pan
that's an
with
interesting
some
technique.
Yeah, no, that's the key. That's the jus.
Okay.
Put that in a pot with some onions and garlic you've softened in butter and oil, and then saute that. And then you could add whatever liquid you want. I added some white wine, a little bit of cream, a little bit of seasoning, and just let that cook until it gets soft and delicious. Maybe puree a bit of it with a hand blender. So I had the leftover of that, and that was, it's like that essence of late fall, the last gasp of the sort of sweet rays of sun that here in Canada are going to go away for some time.
For a long time.
Lunch meetings. I was actually thinking recently of writing a book about lunch meetings, like one of those short books in defense of them. I mean, I think it's one of those things that really went by the wayside very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic, especially as people began working from home. And yet I think there's something unique about the lunch meeting and beautiful. It tends to be this simultaneously decadent and yet incredibly productive space of time where in a relatively short period of time, there's this kind of mixture of interpersonal, interhuman connection and enjoyment and a sort of decadent reality. It's like you go for a real lunch meeting, in a city somewhere, and it's a real it's an event. It's very different from the standard lunches, which is I had a bite of a leftover, I had a little sandwich, or I had a little salad that I got in a clamshell that I ate at my desk like a schmuck, and it's to go out for lunch is this incredible treat. But I just also find, because it's in the middle of the day, because you tend to be you and one other person, it's very intentional. You're not going out as couples. It's not part of a party. You're not out on the weekend. There's this joy to it. And I've made so many great friendships with people and maintained so many great work relationships with, say, editors or other people that I've done work with over the years. And so much of that has been based around lunch. I could go on about this for the full hour of our conversation. I have many different thoughts in it. And so I am a firm proponent of the lunch meeting, or just, lunch in general as an event.
I guess that's what makes you a quintessentially great author. Is I've clearly had many, many lunch meetings in my life, but never taken a moment to reflect on the totality of the experience, like you just communicated in a somewhat brief, but it could be quite extended form. And I appreciate that.
Let's break it down for one hot second while we're here. I mean, I actually recall we had a lunch. I don't know if it was a meeting. You had an idea about a sort of record listening bar that you wanted to open, which now I've noticed there's a number of them, Japanese style. We were at Say What, the original craft beer bar in downtown Toronto, with another friend of you whose name completely eludes me. And
Greco.
Yeah. And it is this, it really was this, it's like this confluence of like, let's catch up. I want to talk about your family and your kids. And you had just had a new kid because you'd gotten remarried or something. And yet there was like this, but I have this idea. It's that seamlessness of it, which I think for a dinner meeting for business is very different. Like the stakes are higher. Like you have a dinner meeting if you're cementing a deal or something, right? Like it's a real, there's a weight to that. A breakfast meeting is very like, okay, I gotta get this in before I do. And we're going to have a lot of coffee. So I'm going to have to poo in like 20 minutes. Fun fact. And
Biology 101.
Yeah. And then any other meeting is, it's like, this is the time of the calendar where we're going to talk, maybe we'll talk in person. We might probably talk on the phone or something. And so lunch it's like this respite that your whole day is kind of built around that lunch meeting. Much to be said about it. Again, we can do a separate episode on that if you want.
All right. Well, it's also like and this is a good segue, but, in the essence of a lunch meeting, it is probably the meal in which hands can be used most freely and politely, right? Like a sandwich, right?
Yes.
And, back in my dating days and in case, Stephanie, you're listening to this, I promise I was never married before. I wasn't getting remarried. It was my first marriage, but, back in my dating days, I used to always make it a point to like go somewhere where, it wasn't classy, where you had to use your hands or get messy or anything along those lines, because it's a great equalizing factor.
It's a good test.
And I used to do that for lunch meetings, as especially when I felt like I was with someone who maybe of a higher echelon, to try and create that normalizing factor. It's a good reminder of all that. Speaking of eating with your hands, and as what I would say is a bit of a foil to the somewhat gourmet dinner and leftover lunch you had today, your first book was about delis. It was called Save the Deli. And just by way of background, one of the best moments of my adult life actually occurred at Sarge's Deli on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. Have you ever been to Sarge's?
Yes.
Okay. It was about 3 or 4 in the morning after quite a night out when the oldest looking man I've ever seen, who was using a walker, came up to our table wearing a hat that said, and insensitive, probably inappropriate joke warning here, but his hat said, 96 is the new 69. And he started making lewd in a 1950s kind of way jokes to the couple of women who were at our table, before pointing to a picture on the wall and revealing that he was in fact the now late but then great Professor Irwin Corey, a comedian that Lenny Bruce described as one of the most brilliant comedians of all time. That and growing up Jewish cemented my love of corned beef on rye. But what's your story? What inspired you to write a book about the dying art of the deli?
It began as a paper I wrote in university, and it was like, you could pick any topic in this class on Jewish sociology, which I took because, like most classes I took, it fit into my schedule. So I would have Fridays off to go skiing, and it was a relatively straightforward A. Terrible ambitions. But, I'd always grown up going to delis with my family here in Montreal, and I noticed that many of them were, closing and disappearing. And so I wanted to find out why. And that brought me back a couple of years later to write that book, which was my first. And, of Jewish people of a certain age, pretty much the only book I've ever written. Like I could sell 1 million copies of my next book, and they'll still be like, you're the guy who wrote the deli book. And that's it. That's all I got. Put it in my tombstone. Just ship it out right now.
There you go.
That's it. That's all you need.
It will last as long as the corned beef that you consumed, probably in the writing of that book. I haven't had a chance actually to read Save the Deli, so tell us what you discovered in that. And even though this has nothing to do with psychedelic experiences, what and looping it all back to psychedelics in this podcast is like, I think what psychedelics open to us is a nature of experience that we often forget. And you're such a great and articulate writer, journalist, these are the words I'm looking for, of reminding us of these experiences that make the human experience so human. So indulge me in what you found in the discovery of in the rediscovery of the deli.
Yes, opening up the doors of cholesterol. And a million other bad jokes based on the one time I read How to Change Your Mind. I could go on about this for some period of time. I mean, I think let's compare it to the psychedelic experience. I mean, the thing about a Jewish delicatessen, especially for someone who isn't of that culture and didn't grow up in it, is like a psychedelic experience. It allows you very quickly and instantaneously, within walking into a place like Sarge's Delicatessen or many of the other Jewish delis that are around this fair world, to completely immerse yourself in a full sensory experience of what that culture is, right? Like, if you're not someone who's grown up Jewish or religious, you're not going to go to a religious service. Maybe you'll go to your friend's son's bar mitzvah or a wedding, but you're not really going to understand what they're saying. They're speaking in a foreign tongue. There's all sorts of rituals. You're not going to be like, oh, I get it now. And so the Jewish deli is this experience where anyone can walk in and instantly kind of get immersed and their brain lit up by what the non-religious, secular, cultural, but kind of historical and yet new Jewish experiences. It smells like only a Jewish deli can. It tastes like it, but also the sounds, the way people will come to your table and kibitz and joke. These are the types of things that you would only have if you grew up in a community where people had those same social characteristics. And I mean, it's no different from going to a dim sum restaurant if you haven't grown up in sort of Cantonese culture, or a dosa restaurant if you're from sort of South Indian culture. It has its own particular immersion into the milieu. And it is, in a way, a trip, right? You see in New York City a tourist go into Katz's from, Japan for the first time. And it's like, whoosh, they are taken into this experience. The sounds, the smells, the sights, the way people are talking, the lingo. It's not just a meal. It's like an amusement park ride that we didn't get to take our children on because they were too young when we went to Canada's Wonderland. And we just wasted $100 that day on, skee ball or whatever. So in that way, it is this immersive experience, which I think are the experiences that are the ones that mean the most. And this brings us back to lunch and the sort of broader topic of analog that I'm talking about, which is like, we can try to replicate these things. We can try to simulate these things, but nothing beats that real thing. Nothing equates it. Nothing can get to it. The best you can hope to do with some VR simulation is like to replicate the feeling of going into Katz's, but it's not going to be the real thing.
You likened it very deftly to a trip, a psychedelic experience, describing it as a full sensory experience, which certainly going into a deli or, into a dim sum place or a dosa house can do. But the other nature of psychedelic experiences is it often reveals something about yourself. So what do you think the Jewish delicatessen experience reveals about Jewish culture?
I think it reveals the personality of it, right? Like, Jewish law and scripture is very well codified. It's the whole nature of it. It's like, it's all in a book. It's all in the laws. It's all there. That here are the commandments. Here are all the, 613 other laws you have to follow. It's very sort of straightforward. The rituals of prescribing how you dress if you're religious and how you do these sorts of other things. But when you get to the question of Jewish culture, it's a very amorphous thing. One is because it's a very diverse group of people, because they were, the Jewish people have lived all over the world and brought on various parts of their culture from Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean to now various, parts in the Americas and so on. And yet you go into a Jewish deli and it's like, it isn't a diner. It is different than a diner. It is different than a dim sum restaurant. It has its own specific culture, and that culture is this sort of untouched, unspoken thing. You can't replicate it. You can't create it. It comes from sort of an immersion in it, a history of that. And all of that unpacks in the sort of psychological, social history that was built around that, and that was built around. And so it's revealing in that way. And it's that it got back to that trip thing where like you come out of a place like Sarge's or, Langer's in Los Angeles, and you're like, wow, that was a really unique experience. Like the sandwich was great, but like the totality of all that adds up to something, and I can't quite put my finger on it. And that thing is its inherent Jewishness, its characteristic that has nothing to do with religion and has nothing to do with Israel and has nothing to do with the sort of ethnicity, but it's like the cultural history and legacy that all those things relate back to, encapsulated in a lunch that you're having, to bring it back to lunch.
No, but it is an interesting exercise, and I don't profess to have the answer, but something in that experience actually reveals elements of what Jewish culture has valued and to some extent selected for. I was having a conversation with someone, and they were speaking. He spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, working as a banker in Hong Kong, and he made some comments about Hong Kong and Chinese culture and certain things that got valued. And he even suggested, and I'm not in any way advocating that this is necessarily true. I have no idea, but he said you can actually start to see it in genetic expression, that certain traits in Chinese culture got selected, not saying like it's part of who it is to be Chinese or Asian, but because those cultural traits got valued at some point, you see kind of natural selection starting to express in the genetics. You can almost see a genetic connection to it. I don't know if there's any truth to it, but there is definitely, I think, truth in all of these experiences as identifying the cultural values of each culture and what we preference, what we value, what we think is worthwhile, and continue to propagate through our culture. And the sandwiches, and I remember going to Vegas and going to the remake, I think, of the Stagecoach they have at one of the Vegas casinos now, and the size of the goddamn corned beef sandwiches. If you want ego death, you will definitely experience some kind of death getting through one of those sandwiches. Has the recent discussion about ultra processed foods being effectively poisons change your perspective on your love of the deli at all, or is it just one of those things we accept as the good with the bad?
It's interesting to bring this back to the central theme of this podcast, and anyone who started a psychedelic company in the past 10 years is the Michael Pollan effect. I, with my book club, recently reread Omnivore's Dilemma, which I first read back in 2007 when it came out, when I was researching this deli book, and I was driving around the United States and North America visiting, 200 something delis over the course of a couple of months. And it had changed my perception then. And really, yes, the environmental, the social impacts and so on, the economic impacts, but you really saw it in taste. Like one of the reasons that the deli had dissipated and was in decline was that so much of it had become sort of turnkey and industrialized, that, people got their meat from 4 different suppliers. And so everything kind of tasted the same, especially in a region, right? You can go to 4 delis in New York and they all use the same corned beef and pastrami and the same rye. So what is the difference? And the same mustard, right? What is the difference between them? And you were starting to see a growth of a new generation of delis that were opening up around the country and even around the world when the book was coming out. And in the decade, like 13 years since, that were trying to recreate that, to trying to source better products, trying to make their own products, make their own meats and bake their own breads from scratch. And we're having, a good degree of success with that. Some of those restaurants survived. Some of those restaurants have fallen prey to the reasons why many restaurants close, rents, costs, staffing, pandemics, recessions, whatnot. But it was very foremost in my mind at that time.
This is for Toronto listeners really only. Did you follow the boom, bust, and echo of the Kaplansky's deli in Toronto and what happened there? Were you following that pretty closely?
Yeah.
What did happen there, by the way?
I mean, again, it's, I think people can say, oh, this place closed and it's the end of delis. It's like, it's the restaurant business. and this is a city where it's one of the hardest cities in the world to operate the restaurant business. We were in Montreal recently, my wife and I, and walking around and we're like, hey, remember that bar we went to in university 20 years ago? It's still there. Why aren't they there in Toronto? Because the rent doubles every 2 years.
Yeah.
What do you expect? Right. It's, so much of that's down to just straight up economics. So it's unfortunate because there are, in a large city, a city with a, deep culinary love, fabulous restaurant city, fabulous eating town, and a city with a large Jewish community, there are very few Jewish delis, but there are new ones that have opened up. continue to open up and are seeing success. I've heard good things about Dave's Deli. Sumalicious in the very corner of the city, which is run by a Sri Lankan Muslim family who, worked at Schwartz's in Montreal, is fabulous, incredible. And so, it keeps going and growing and evolving. And that gives me hope, and it takes on its own flavor and character.
Very fair. And this is my last comment on delis, but only in Toronto could you have a place that was called Ginsberg and Wong, yes. Ginsberg and Wong's, classic. Which was a combination of Jewish deli with Chinese food. What a wonderful combination, which no longer exists. Although I did see at the Royal Winter Fair, there's like a stall of Ginsberg and Wong's, but it's I don't know. I don't know if they just stole the name or not, but I was like, oh, that gives me hope. I'd love to see that come back. All right. You can tell I haven't had lunch today, so maybe that's why I'm a little bit more focused on the deli conversation. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you for helping promote my book that came out 13 years ago, Ronan. This is great.
Whatever. We're extending royalties, and we are going to get to the juicy stuff now. So I'm not sure if you remember, but you and I met for the first time a number of years ago at the Fireside Conference, which is held at Camp Walden, a pretty perfect place for a guy who likes to talk about the analog world to be talking about this stuff. I remember hearing your talk and absolutely relishing the somewhat contrarian perspective that you offered relative to what everyone was thinking about the coming digital world. What started you down this path of really becoming, I would say, the poster boy for a very healthy and robust analog world outside of what lives in pixels and bits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. It was the beginning of October and it was absolutely freezing. Very cold that first year. And I never went after that. But we had a lot of great times. I gave that talk in front of a bonfire at the...
That's right.
Color comic unit, which is where I was at first a camper at that camp and then later as a counselor. So wonderful. Lots of fun. We had a great time. This fascination with what I later called the revenge of analog. And now, in the new book, The Future is Analog. Let's just call it analog. The sort of non-digital alternatives to the things that we're told are kind of inevitable and where our destiny lies. It began with, I guess personal love and curiosity, right? Why 15 years ago, at a time when, iPods were sort of the standard, digital downloading was widespread, and streaming had just begun. Services like Pandora and I think Spotify launched in 2009. Why was I suddenly seeing record stores and vinyl records coming back? Why, at a time when Amazon was in its rapid ascendancy and the Kindle and other sort of major ebook platforms, Kobo or the Nook, were coming out and they were promising to do for books what the iPod had done for and Napster had done for music, were independent bookstores reopening and growing and expanding? Why was everybody I know who was pitching their startup doing it with a iPhone in one hand and a paper moleskin journal in the other? What was going on? There was sort of two competing narratives. One was the standard narrative that everything was going to become digital, and this was the inevitability of Moore's law, and it was exponential increase. And if e-commerce is 2% this year, it's going to be 5% next year, 10% the year after that, and 30% in the end of the decade. So forget about opening a store. And then on the other hand, wow, like now there's 10 record stores around my house, and another independent bookstore opened up, and their sales are growing and they're doing great and they're expanding. Why is everybody buying coloring books? What is going on here that the narrative of the future is not so simple and straightforward? Why is this happening? There's something bigger than just these consumer products that I'm seeing. And that brought me deeper into investigating why that was happening. Why was vinyl growing? Why were bookstores growing? Why were, paper products? What was the deeper value of these things that we already had alternative digital technologies for? Why were they growing? Why were they getting a new value? And what did this say about the world that we live in a much bigger way, about how we relate to digital technology and the analog, non-digital world that's still the majority of what matters in our lives, right?
And what did you find in that exploration? I read the book when it first came out. And I remember it kind of looked at, I think, three major trends, which was like vinyl, books, and I think photography was a piece of it as well. But I may be misremembering that. But I've noticed recently, like my stepdaughter in the last couple of years bought a Polaroid, which seems pretty antithetical for a 17-year-old to want in this day and age. But what did you find? What was the answer to why is this happening?
Well, I think your stepdaughter is the great example of this, right? Here's someone who has grown up photographically only knowing digital cameras, right? Every photo that's been taken of her that she's taken in her life has been most likely through a digital camera, whether it was, a point and click Canon or whatever, or over the past, 10, 15 years, a phone, a smartphone camera, right? And so why would someone like that, who has access to these, super powerful digital cameras that you can share and edit and do everything you want and takes a much better picture than this expensive, cumbersome, 50-year-old piece of film technology or more that sometimes turns out and sometimes doesn't, and each one costs $1 basically. If you're talking about the Fujifilm Instax or the Polaroid Impossible ones, like $2 a picture. Like, why would she use that? I thought of that when our friend's daughter Abby, who's now 15 or 14, she had her 8th birthday, and she got an Instax camera. Like, why do you want this? She's like, oh, it's really cool because you take a picture and you only get what you get, and you get to hold it to someone. It's different than your phone. It's different, right? It's not better. It's not, oh, I judge the pixels on, the resolution, and I find that this one is superior aesthetically. It's like, this experience is a different experience. It's a complementary experience to the digital one that I've been given and is just, as normal as air in my life. And I prefer it. Why are sales of paper books as strong or stronger than they were, despite the predictions that ebooks would overtake them? Ebooks are vastly less expensive. They're much easier to get. You tap, you have it. You don't have to go to some store. They don't weigh anything. You don't have to buy cases. You don't have to carry them when you're moving. They don't cut your fingers. Like, my kids are always like, I have a paper cut. It's like, analog problems, man. You don't have to cut down trees to make them. And yet 90% of readers read on paper. And that has remained consistent throughout. What is the value of this? Right? What is the value of it? The value of it is a different experience than reading on a tablet, even the best tablet or e-reader, right? It has physicality. It has that smell. It has that feel. Our bodies respond to it in a different way. Not everyone. There are people who prefer to read ebooks. But the vast majority don't. Why is that? What is the reason? Because it offers a different experience, a complementary experience. And so that's what the analog does, right? Once there is a choice between an analog and a digital version of something, right? Once digital technology comes along, it's like, we can now offer you the choice of recording this through our software platform or going into a studio and recording it. You have a clear choice of what it is. And you, as a human being of free will and mind, are able to make that choice. Okay, which one makes sense for me, right? Does this one make sense for me? Does this platform make sense for me? Does this platform not make sense for me? So recording your podcast, in this way, it makes sense for you. It makes sense for me at this moment. But maybe if you're recording a huge podcast, maybe you think this thing became the number one podcast, you'd say, I kind of want to be in studio with my guests so I can sit and talk to them. And it's worth it for me, even the extra cost and the hassle, because I'm going to get a better product or a better conversation out of it. Or maybe you believe that, maybe you don't, right? And so it all comes down to the inherent experience of that. And for so long, we've assumed that the digital experience would ultimately be the superior experience because it would be cheaper or faster or more powerful or better. And time and again,
or perfect, right?
Or perfect,
like your
right?
phone is always perfect.
Frictionless.
Yep.
And time and again, we realize that actually what we're doing with those perfect experiences, we're sacrificing a lot of the things that we don't realize we get value of. In my new book, The Future is Analog, which I'm just going to segue into talking about because that's why we're here.
We're going to get there too, but yeah,
we're
all right.
Get there. But this is the sort of thing, like the realization that we had during the pandemic was that the perfect experiences of digital that were promised to us and kind of forced upon us out of necessity in, the middle of 2020 were wildly insufficient in most aspects of our life, right? If you can find me one person who is like, you know what? Digital school, virtual school, totally the way to go. Tried it. It's the best. Never putting my kids back in a classroom again. I would love to speak to that person. I would love to know who they are and what their deal is.
Actually, one question before we hop into it. So we talked about like sort of books and vinyl and photography. Do you see this starting to percolate up through the lens of the revenge of analog, not necessarily the future's analogs, but through the revenge of like other instances of that? Have there been other ones that have percolated up recently where you see things that had been cast aside as antiquated making a comeback, or are those still the kind of primary?
Those are the best known ones. I mean, there are other areas that people have pointed to in different examples. Certain companies bringing back catalogs, business cards, certain print products, for example. Things like concerts and live theater. There was this idea that, streaming would do away with all these things. And, in the years leading up to the pandemic, Broadway had their best seasons ever, concerts sold out, all these sorts of, again, thoroughly analog experiences, Shakespeare in the Park, like lineups for Shakespeare outside in the rain. So, I think film, books, records are the kind of glaring obvious examples, also because those are the things that are so much more cumbersome and easily disrupted and non-essential. When it gets to talking about things like experiences rather than goods, like schools or work or the other life experiences that we had to endure digitally during the pandemic, it's that deeper conversation, which is really what the new book is about. It's less about the physical goods and more about, the places, spaces, and relationships.
I don't know if you've ever heard the Cologne or Cone concert by Keith Jarrett. It's so magnificent. And the story behind it is wonderful, which is he went to this concert, the piano, which was totally out of tune, right? And ended up having one of what seems probably the greatest musical performance of human existence on an out of tune piano where he couldn't use all the keys. And a lot of people look at that and point to the fact that friction, actually aided in creativity. And there's so much depth to this world that we can experience if we just choose to put restrictions on what we're willing to explore. Whereas the digital unleashes total optionality and freedom. The physical, the analog, puts parameters on that. And there's wondrous things that can come out of that. With that thought, I will flip to the future is analog. You can probably tell I'm already a fan of your thinking, but you had me hooked very early on in the new book with a Spaceballs reference of fuck, even in the future nothing works, and then you had this line about your experience at the beginning of COVID. You said, quote, "We had 6 bedrooms, 4 televisions, a reliable internet connection, endless space outside, a great lake, woods and trails nearby, a closed golf course to walk on, plus a sauna and a hot tub. Go to a dictionary and look up the term white privilege. That's me in that house, and it fucking sucked." That was that experience was a catalyst for the future's analog.
Apologies to my mother-in-law whose cottage I'm referencing in that. It was a great place to be. It was better than being in this small house. So, but yeah, it sucked.
Totally resonated with me. My experience was very similar. In that book, you go through 7 instances where the future digital utopia that we were promised turned out to be significantly misleading, or really should be looked at as maybe a complement to the analog world. And I'd love to let's go through those. From top to bottom. So what were the kind of 7 frameworks where you looked at what we experienced during COVID, which could have been totally disrupted through a digital future, and it turns out that that's probably not going to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I did 7 because it really broke it down into the days of the week, which was just a narrative framing device my wife thought of. So compliments to her. But when you think back to that period of time, late March, early April 2020, as you're readjusting your life to conduct it almost entirely online, think about what the pundits were saying. You would hear on, CNBC and Bloomberg and LinkedIn and other places from people who were in the business of, creating or promoting digital technologies. This is it. This is the future. It's finally arrived. We fast forwarded, 10 years and 2 weeks, and this is it. The disruption that we've long preached has arrived, and there's no going back. There's no going back to schools. It's so much more efficient to teach every student in the world online. It's going to be customized and wonderful. There's no going back to the office. We don't need offices and commutes and those horrible office relations and the bad birthdays and the abusive relationships and power dynamics and cubicles and uncomfortable desks. We're done with stores, wasteful grocery stores and clothing shops and other sorts of retail outlets when everything could be delivered to you at the press of a button so fast, so efficiently, so much less expensive. We're done with going out to theaters and sitting around. You want to see Elton John? He's performing in his living room, so you can sit in your living room and watch it, and it's free and it's wonderful. It's streaming. It's high definition. You can see every pore in his face. The future of cities is here, and everything's going to be optimized. We're going to have smart cities, and this is how we're going to live, and everything's going to be delivered, and it's going to be self-driving electric cars, and powered by AI. The city is going to be this hyper efficient machine instead of these, kind of crusty, crazy, somewhat dangerous, somewhat chaotic places. Even our spirituality, our body, right? We're going to be optimizing for every aspect of it. You can do it online. You love to go to a gym. The gym is here now. Get on your Peloton and ride, and the best instructors are going to yell at you. And if you want to get in touch with your soul, pick a denomination, pick a religion, your rabbi, your imam, your priest, your shaman, your holotropic breathwork leader is there online, on Zoom, or whatever it is you want. We will deliver the psychedelics right to your door. And you can, have whatever experience you want in this future. This is it. We have arrived at the goal that we were sort of going to. And what we found very, very early on is how insufficient that was in pretty much every single aspect of our life. Was it more convenient for most people to work from home than, drive or take a subway or a streetcar or bike to an office? Yes. But was the nature of doing video meetings all day exhausting and gave people headaches and made doing the work that they had to do more challenging? In many cases, yes. School, the promise of virtual school is, and the promise of remote school is something that people have been talking about since Edison developed film and radio. 100 years ago, the best lecturers in the world would deliver information directly to students without putting them in buildings and making them sit, and, it would be customized, and it was an unmitigated disaster everywhere in the world. I mean, there may be a small number of students who benefited from it. Mostly those were students with severe social anxieties or who were on very extreme parts of the autism spectrum. For the most part, students did far worse learning. Their social lives fell apart. They were riddled with anxiety, and they lost their sense of community, right? The idea that, everything we wanted could be delivered to us. Yes, you could order whatever you wanted, but it got more expensive. It was frustrating. And when stores reopened, even for brief periods of socially distant shopping, they were packed, right? Not just grocery stores where the essentials of life are, like record stores, bookstores, shoe stores, the most frivolous, innocuous crap. People were lining up to go touch and buy and feel and talk to people in the store. That's what they wanted. And online shopping sales have been declining. The stock of Shopify has been going down. Amazon, their e-commerce business is seeing its worst years pretty much since inception because of the drastic predictions of what they would do and what the reality bore out to be. And I think you're seeing it in all these other aspects, right? Peloton bikes are gathering dust. I actually unplugged the one from my mother-in-law's cottage. She bought it, she plugged it in, she used it once. 9 months later, I'm just gonna like literally take this thing off life support. So just for the electricity bill alone, and like maybe one day someone will plug it back in or sell it. What are you seeing in cities? You're seeing that the greatest benefit that happened to cities wasn't the emergence of, smart cities and smart infrastructure. It was like, hey, we can put patio tables and sidewalks and in parking spots, and it'll make this place so much more vibrant, right? The analog things were what mattered. And I think you feel it right up to the sort of spiritual aspect of it. I'm Jewish, as are you. I went to the first high holiday Jewish New Year Rosh Hashanah service the other day at my synagogue in person. People are still wearing masks, and it was what it was meant to be, right? I gave up on doing that crap online after the first time because it wasn't real. It didn't touch me. It didn't satisfy me. It didn't give me that sense of community. And so I think when I talk about the future is analog, I'm not saying we're done with digital technology. What I'm saying is, we had staked for decades the imagination of our future on this utopian perfect notion of digital technology coming and creating this perfect world, solving all the issues we had with school, with work, with community, with cities, with culture, with whatever. And that was our goal. That was our destination. But when we arrived at some early version of that destination, it wasn't that the technology was insufficient. It wasn't like, maybe if the resolution of this digital school was better for my, 7-year-old daughter, it would work out better. Perhaps she would have gotten more out of it and learned more and been happier if her teacher had been displayed on a VR headset. No, it was that the inherent flaw in that and the inherent failure of it, the insufficiency of it was revealed so nakedly because we were all forced to undergo it, right? It was this forced, A/B testing in the words of the digital industry, right? We A/B tested the digital future, and for the most part, it failed.
And the section or the chapter on education to be, probably maybe it's because I've got young children about the same age as yours, and seeing it. But can you go into? I mean, everyone knows that the experience sucked, right? It was never fun being stuck at your house, like doing Google Meets and all that kind of stuff. But
never fun.
Yes.
It was like a repeated kick in the balls every day, all day for 2 years here in Canada.
And most of us share that experience, but it got it is the perfect, I think, platform not to just say, the digital world is not our utopian future, but it's also the opportunity to lean in a lot more to talk about why the analog world is not doesn't feel better, but it is in fact better. And I thought the discussion about what it means to learn as opposed to be informed and and that kind of distinction. So I'd love for you to go deeper into some of the science and data that we saw about the school experience as well.
Well, the data was pretty universal, around the world, according to reports from the OECD, which is an organization that tracks sort of the wealthiest, 2-3 dozen countries in the world and has markers on many other nations as well. That the experience with online learning, virtual learning, digital learning, whatever you want to call it, was pretty abysmal. In terms of learning, information retention, sort of academic markers, grades, whatever, maybe in the best case, it was sort of quasi even, maybe a little bit down. In most cases, it went down. And the worst part was that was very unequal. In wealthy schools, in wealthy neighborhoods where parents have time, one parent has time to sit at home, perhaps hire a babysitter or a nanny or an extra tutor, the results may have been a little bit better, where there were devices or so forth. But as people's economic situation grew more precarious, you saw greater learning loss, you saw greater inequality showing up in the experience that people had. For a family in a poor country, for a under resourced family, Black family in Maryland, inner city Maryland, let's say, or a Latino family in a poor neighborhood of Arizona, the learning loss was tremendous. The social loss was tremendous. The physical danger to kids was serious. And so, right there you have the pricking of the bubble of, well, if everybody has access to this, it's going to be more equal. It's going to provide a greater equality because digital will give everyone an equal access and an equal platform. But equality was far more than just turning on a screen and having access to the same informational lecture. And that showed the deeper meaning in education. And I think all these other spaces, analog spaces that we're talking about, that the information is not just the thing. And this is the main disconnect between the belief in a digital future and the sort of utopian ideal built around it and analog reality, right? Which is what we kind of crashed into in 2020. And that is, well, the information is what education is about, right? It's about knowing your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s from kindergarten all the way up to university, and isn't it more efficient just to deliver that information through the most efficient platform possible, which is the internet, let's say, or computers or tablets or whatnot, or VR. But what we saw very quickly is what, education technology critic Larry Cuban, who's at Stanford and has been there for many years, and I interviewed him for both books, said is the reality of the core of what education is. Education is information that's translated into knowledge through relationships, real human relationships, the relationship that a teacher has with their students, the relationships that students have with each other, the relationships that students and the teachers and the school have with the parents and the surrounding community. And all of those relationships, the friendships, the rivalries, the mentorship, the authority that's bestowed in the way a classroom is set up, the romances, the shifting social dynamics of a place like high school, all of that merged with the information, the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, builds knowledge, human knowledge. And that is not a binary thing of like, I have shown you these 1, 2, 3s and ABCs, and now you know them, therefore you are educated. The process of education is the process of learning of how to be a human in a society. And if anyone thinks that that is something you can teach people through a fucking platform like this, or some other version of a flat screen with a little video box in it, they are insanely delusional. And I think that is, for me, one of the reasons why my criticism of sort of the digital utopianism comes in hardest in the world of education. Because for 30, 40 years, there have been people in the ed tech business in Silicon Valley and elsewhere who are promising this idealized future of education and achieving it through digital technology. And they have been consistently failing at it time and again, different devices, different platforms, right? You think of Sebastian Thrun and the great MOOC movement of a decade ago, the massive open online course. We are going to have university lectures from the best universities in the world, and kids in Africa are going to be able to, go to school in Harvard. And it's like, and here's the first one we're going to do at the University of, California, San Jose, and we're going to teach this. It's going to be great. And we're going to watch it. It's like 10% of people complete the class, right? Like just a pathetic amount, like just a fucking rounding error. And yet time and again, people are like, well, that didn't work, but here's another $1 billion. Go develop the next platform for VR. It amazes me that in two industries or fields where objective data is supposed to be the guiding principle, education and science and technology, that blindness for education continues to happen. And that is a metaphor for so many of the other areas where we saw, the failure of that digital future when it was pressed into reality. And so what is that lesson that education teaches us, which, we can extrapolate out to all these other areas, culture, cities, work, faith, conversation and friendships, for example, where again, it's like, we have a digital solution. This is the future of it. Oh, it didn't work. Why not? Because fundamentally, we as human beings are analog creatures, right? We are flesh and blood, biological beings that, look away from your screen, Ronan, look to your left, look to your right, look up, like literally look, get your eyes out the fucking screen. There you go. You're a physical creature in a world. You relate to that world at its best and most salient in a analog way through all your senses, and a technology that is only going to engage a part of those senses, even with the best sensors and gloves or whatever the hell they're promising to make, is always going to fall flat, right? And now I will bring it back to the psychedelic experience. Why is the psychedelic experience so powerful? Whether we're talking about taking mushrooms on a canoe trip, as some of us in this podcast may have done last week, or whether we are talking about, the ketamine treatment that you do, and other treatments that are, treating people with depression and PTSD and other psychological ailments that are, some of the stickiest problems we have. It is because, those substances are engaging the individuals and their brains and their bodies in the most visceral human physical way possible, right? When you go on a trip, whether it's, through medical reasons or recreational, you are at your most present in the world. Your senses are lit up. Your cortexes are firing on all cylinders. You're at the most human you can be. If I were to create some visual representation of that with CGI and show you it to a video, wow, that looks cool. The trees on the lake look like paintings. That's amazing. But to actually experience something like that is a life-changing experience. And again, that's what it comes down to, right? We are physical creatures as human beings who live in a physical world, and our most important things in that world and the currency by which everything is built around are human relationships that are strongest when they are at their most physical. Think of your closest relationship as a human. It is people to whom you are the most physically close to, a lover or spouse or partner who you're so physically close with, like you're sleeping in the same bed and, sometimes without clothes, and, children, right? And friends who you hug and put your arm around and spend time with in close physical proximity, friends you've done road trips with or camping or, travel with, or you're just hanging out a lot, right? That gets back to that idea of lunch. Like, what is the value of that lunch meeting? It's physical proximity. It's like, oh yeah, Ronan, like we literally broke bread together. He took me to a place where I didn't have cutlery. What's with that guy? But that's that genuine analog human experience. And so that is the thing that is been our past and our present. And we forget that it's the core of our future because we thought, well, once we could replace that with a virtual breaking of bread in the metaverse, then think how much time and money we'll save by not having to go break bread. It's insane. It's ridiculous. And yet we put so much of our faith and belief into that insane, ridiculous, childish notion.
Pulling it back to psychedelics as well, which often invite exploring the ultimate questions, which is, what is the purpose of it all? It also begs the question of why, the education that you get delivered through a MOOC or online. It's like, yeah, you get the data, but what is the purpose of education? And I believe fundamentally everything we should be doing or, that we ought to be doing should be to enhance the human experience by nature, right? If we're not doing it for that reason, what reason are we doing it in the first place? And I think that's, I'm guessing in some ways at the very, macro level, that's the invitation that this book invites, being like, what the hell are we doing? It's like, yes, there's ways that digital technology can complement and enhance the experience, but it can never be a replacement for.
Exactly. And I think we would sort of like playing with those notions, and they would be dismissed as, oh, well, this is the way of the future. You don't want to be left behind. This is the way things are going. But all of a sudden, when it was such a stark contrast that all we had was the diet of digital, of what it could supply us for a good reason, right? We weren't allowed out of our houses for, months at a time. We very clearly saw the limits of that most human experience, that we could not get the things we wanted, even from an innocuous activity such as going to the grocery store. we couldn't get the things we wanted out of that online. We could get the bananas, we could get the chicken nuggets and the eggs and all those things. They'd be brought to our door. Really convenient. My God, that was easy. We saved a lot of time. Maybe we even saved some money. But we couldn't get all the other things that we didn't even realize we thought we wanted. I was in a grocery store in Toronto last Monday shopping for this canoe trip that I'd gone on with my friend Toby. And we were in the tea aisle looking at teas. And there was an old woman, old Italian grandmother who was in this. It's an Italian grocery store called Fiesta Farms. And she was in this thing and she was asking us in kind of a, her best English, like looking at different sleep time teas and saying, will this work? Will this help me? And we're like, oh, well, yeah. My friend's like, yeah, this is a good sleep time tea. She's like, yeah, my husband died recently and I haven't been able to sleep. And I just want something to like help me relax and go to sleep, right? That was nothing to do with a transaction for the best tea. She wasn't going to go on Amazon and read reviews of 8 Celestial Seasoning Sleepy Time teas to find which one had the best chance of giving her a relaxing thing. That wasn't what she wanted. She was in that space in her community as a woman who was feeling broken and alone and vulnerable as a human being. And these two random idiots were there trying to talk to her about tea. And she wanted to tell them about the pain and hurt that she was going through as a human. And we had a very human moment where we, patted her back and told her it would be okay. And, tried to pick the best tea for her. That's a moment that I don't think I'll ever forget. And that's such a human part of our world. I hope a part of our future that we didn't realize we were doing away with when we were just trying to put groceries online. And so I think this experience is something I hope we can learn from, right? What's the whole point of doing A/B testing if you don't then take the information and learn from it? It would be a waste if we then said, well, that didn't work, but let's charge forward and we're going to build, a better exercise bike online. It's like, maybe that's not the solution. Maybe the solution is we have that, but we still want to make sure that we have enough bike lanes for kids to be able to go out and ride outside and learn what it's actually like, or have gyms where people not only go to get exercise and spin their legs really fast on a bike, but like they meet friends, they feel better about themselves, they maybe meet romantic partners, they change their body image of themselves because they're out in the world and with this other group of people. There's so much more to life than just the parts that we think we're looking at.
Thank you for sharing that story. It was beautiful. And I think a good reminder of why this is a really important conversation. Last week, on the way home, I was listening to a podcast, the Lex Friedman podcast, Friedman, however you pronounce it. And they had Ray Kurzweil on, the renowned futurist, Ray Kurzweil.
The singular futurist, as we shall call him.
Yes, who is predicting that the singularity will occur somewhere around 2029 is his prediction. I wish everybody could have seen that. And I think the reason this is a particularly important conversation is because in some ways what Ray Kurzweil is predicting, maybe he's a prophet from the future. It feels like an inevitability, but you just made a gesture with your hand that I won't repeat for censorship purposes. But
who censors this? It's a podcast.
Nobody.
There are literally Nazis making podcasts out there, Ronan. I made a tuggy motion with my hand when he mentioned the singularity.
All right, there we go. Thank you. What inspired that response?
There is a blindness to the certainty of someone like Mr. Kurzweil, who's a brilliant inventor and thinker, that past financial and technological success equals, a unfailing vision of the future, that he is a prophet, right? If you go to Times Square, there are people standing there with signs talking about how the world will die, or the Lord will come back, or the Mashiach is returning in the next year. Repent, repent, repent. Who have just a fervent belief in their own messianic future, as Ray Kurzweil or other, techno-futurists, singularity believers, techno-utopians, whatever you want to call them, believing that our future is tied up and destiny is going to be dictated by the convergence of AI and VR and, a couple of other, I don't know, acronyms. But again, all of that ignores the reality of the human experience and what humans actually want. Like, in 5 years, computers going to be so good to talk to that, you're going to have a chatbot that's going to be able to emote and empathize with that poor woman in the grocery store. That woman doesn't want a fucking chatbot. That's not the future she wants. She wants people to talk to her. She wants someone to comfort her. That's what gives her meaning. That's what gives all of us meaning. And so this messianic, dogmatic belief in digital technology as our salvation is no different from any other sort of messianic, dogmatic belief in some sort of future, whether it's, heaven or hell, right? And I think for so long, while the world of business and the world of sort of mainstream culture has not really paid much credence to the messianic pronunciations of religions, right? No one's saying, "Oh, we better base our 5-year forecast for this, large CPG company on the Mormon, prophecy or the Aztec calendar or whatever." No one's doing that. But all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, I went to a conference and I saw Ray Kurzweil and he said that in, 6 years, robots are going to be driving us everywhere. So we're going to abandon our human drivers on our transit program in the city. And we're focusing entirely on robots. We're all in on robots. We're all in on AI. We're all in on VR. Like, this is it. This is the future. It's a simplistic, childish notion. Will those technologies become better? Of course. Will they be able to do things that we never thought possible? Yes. And open up, new areas of opportunities for business, for culture, for creation, for whatnot. Of course. But one is, there's always unintended consequences. I think if you think back 15 years to the tremendous explosion of social media, the golden age of Facebook and Twitter and that opening was like, these are the tools that are going to take democracy around the world and spread peace and love and kumbaya. And it's like, another genocide created by, that was organized on Facebook. Sorry, not really our fault. Sorry that democracy's dead in America. But, hey, Discord, like, it's cool. It's kind of cool. So one's the law of unintended consequences. These same things have the potential for that you put so much belief in positively. We don't talk about their potential for disruption. I don't mean Terminator style, enslavement by robots. I just mean like the erosion of the things that make us human. And the other thing is, again, getting back to that desire. It's like, with the exception of a small group of people who spend a lot of their time thinking and talking about this, going to these conferences and speaking in the same coded world. I mean, you were in the world of tech, Ronan. The circular backroom, echo chamber that it is. When you get out into the real world and talk to your relatives and your friends and your kids and you see what actually goes on in life and you value what matters to you, it's divorced from the reality of what people want. Ray Kurzweil believes the singularity is our future, but ask any other person you meet on the street whether that's something they would desire if it was possible.
One final question. Mushroom enhanced canoe trip that you took this past weekend. Any great insights that came out of that other than appreciating, I'm sure, a wonderful, well, it may have been raining actually given the weather in Ontario the last couple of weeks, but any other great insights that came out of other than appreciating the wonderful nature that we have around here?
I think it's the value and the deepening of the relationships that happened over the past 2 years. This was with a group of friends who were in my book club. We became much closer over the pandemic, especially when, it was really one of the only social interactions we had. We did one virtual club. It was terrible. And so we met in person in people's backyards at distance and blah, blah, blah. We had like dinner parties and snowstorms. And I think the thing that I realized on the trip with these friends, and this was kind of like something we've been talking about for a year, was, the most important thing that came out of the pandemic was not the familiarity we had with the new technologies, learning how to Zoom and learning how to do these things. It was realizing the value of the human relationships that we were deprived of, right? The relationships with friends and family who we weren't able to see or have dinners with, or, kids sleep over at their grandparents' house for periods of time. The relationships that you would have with your kids would have with their teachers, which was, a fraction of what it needed to be when it was online. The relationships you would have as an audience member to a musician that you were going to go see live, which was just cut off when you were watching that on a screen. The relationships that you had to your community and your city, the thing that became most important to all of us were those relationships, to neighbors, to friends, to whoever you saw on the street, even when you were wearing masks, right? That's what mattered. And that's what still matters. And that's what matters more. And that's what we have to build the future around, not whatever technology comes out and allows us to do something and someone else to make money off it. I think if we can focus the way we think about the future on those relationships, those human relationships, the ones that happen at their best and their most when you're all together face to face, huddled under a tarp, trying to, cook in a windstorm while the mushrooms are wearing off, then the future is bright.
And with that, if people want to pick up a copy of The Future's Analog or learn more about the various books that we've touched on today of your penmanship, where can they find more information?
Bookstores, libraries, the barely updated website I have, saxdavid.com, I think. I don't know. The occasional dumb thing I post on Twitter, which is less and less these days. I actually have a timer on my computer that limits me to 15 minutes of social media each day, which is just enough time to go on, check messages, respond to them, maybe post one dumb thing, and then be kicked off and have to fend for my brain in the rest of the world, which gives me lots of time to go for lunch.
Excellent. David, thanks so much, man. I've done a lot of podcasts now. I think we're close to 70 episodes, and this is probably the one where I enjoy just sitting back and listening the most. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you. Thank you for your support and your interest, and for deleting my Ray Kurzweil jerky motion from.
I'm happy to leave it in there. You'd be surprised at how many angry people get. I got people like lashing out at us because I let Luke Story, share one of his beliefs that Anthony Fauci is the devil, and apparently it's not okay to give people a platform to at least share their beliefs. So
now you're off Spotify. Now Joni Mitchell canceled you too.
Exactly. Anyway, I really appreciate it. Let's do lunch.
Let's do lunch. That sounds great.
It's been said that those who shun the whimsy of life experience rigor mortis before death. And if there's one person whose fate will not include premature rigor mortis, it's David. Since the day I heard him first speak at a startup conference at a summer camp of all places, how fitting, I've been a fan of his thinking. I mean, how can you not appreciate someone who says something like, and I quote, "One day when we tell our grandchildren about this brief, transformational period in history, we will save the particular hell of the Zoom cocktail party for late at night, when they are slightly more mature and can truly appreciate horror stories." You may be asking, what does a guy writing about vinyl and books and in-person experiences have any business being on a podcast ostensibly about psychedelics? Well, it's this. I personally think that important message that David exemplifies through his life and all of his writing isn't just about his precocious wisdom, but rather it's about his willingness to recognize that, despite the feeling that sometimes our future is sealed by the sheer mass of momentum that we feel, whether it's toward a technocratic digital utopia driven by startups and venture capital, or to a burnt-out, self-imposed post-industrial environmental apocalypse that could have been avoided with the slightest bit of political leadership, to the likely state of something in between, we, the people, each individual one of us, get to ultimately have a say in writing that narrative. And David invites us to start thinking critically about asking the important questions like, what if we define the future not by what we could theoretically build with digital technology, but what we actually want as humans? What if we can learn from the months and years of the pandemic, not as a brief deviation from our steady march toward a promised destination, but as a valuable lesson in digital technology's limitations and the future we really want? In my opinion, we need more people willing to put their hands up and ask these kinds of questions, and the future we want to create. Because right now, the future is just a story that is yet to be written. And if there's one thing I've come to learn about psychedelics, it's that they give us more freedom to ultimately change the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we're going. As a quick reminder, please follow, rate, and review Field Tripping wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for our newsletter at fieldtriphealth.com/podcast. Thank you for listening to Field Tripping. I'm your host, Ronan Levy. Until next time, stay curious, breathe properly, and remember, every day is a field trip if you let it be one. Field Tripping is created by Ronan Levy. Our producer is Conrad Page, and associate producer is Macy Baker. Thank you to David Sachs for joining us today. To learn more about his work and to pre-order The Future is Analog, visit saxdavid.com. That's SAXDAVID.com. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Click the subscribe button to my left to never miss a release, and click here to check out past episodes. See you next week.